私の美しさに惚れてしまいましたか？
Philip is by far one of the most impactful characters in Overlord. Not only was he the single person responsible for destroying the entire kingdom, but he was also the only person to claim victory against the Sorcerer Kingdom. A spectacular accomplishment we unfortunately never got to see in the anime. So, if you're wondering what exactly it is Philip did to beat Nazarick, well, here's an entire video dedicated to how it happened. But first, this video is sponsored by Nikkei, an immersive sci-fi RPG shooter campaign. So, if you're looking for a unique shooter case, the only way Philip could come up with to overcome this problem was by simply doing something that would diminish the Sorcerer Kingdom's supply. If they could just lower their yield by, say, stealing supplies from one of their convoys, then not only would he be doing his nation a service by stealing from an enemy, but it would also encourage merchants to flock to him. I mean, he would after all become the courageous hero who struck first against one of their sworn enemies. Once word of that got out, it would only be a matter of time until merchants would be lining up for him, at which point he could just sell them the very crops that he'd stolen, making this a triple-faceted plan with significant benefits. So, with the genius idea being to levy his villagers and attack the convoy in Vianney's domain, Philip would proudly present his plans before setting off to bring them to life. What the anime didn't show after was that all this was a clever setup from the two nobles who were with him, specifically this one here. You see, as a noble who had come into power through a similar means as Philip, it was only natural that he too become part of the faction Philip was leading. It's not like he enjoyed being led by such an imbecile, but considering that these were the cards that he was dealt, Vianney had no choice but to play along with them. So, knowing all too well that his faction was the one of misfits, Vianney concocted a plan to bring about change from the inside. He would present himself as this weak and insignificant noble, then use that image to place himself under the wings of a greater power, an important trait only hinted at by Vianney's lackluster outfit. It was very subtle in the anime, but the reason he had gotten so visibly upset from Philip ruining his outfit was because that
実験が始まりました。レーダーを活性化しますはずです。
手が荒れるのは嫌なんですけどね。ついてきてみなさい。めまいなど感じません。普段の踊りに比べてこれくらいは良いものが入っていてほしいですね。セカンドステップですね。ここですよ。めまいなど感じません。普段の踊りに比べてこれくらいは何か輝くものが入っていればいいのですが。輝いてくれてささやかな言葉、美しさはにじみ出るものです。石ころからの美しさを見つけ出すのが美学なのです。石像を見ると霊感が湧いてきますね。踊りはファーストステップが大事なのですよ。セカンドステップですね。もっと華麗に踊りましょうか。静かな場所ですね。期待してはいけませんよね。知っています。輝いてますね。踊りはファーストステップが大事なのですよ。ここですよ。何か輝くものが入っていればいいのですが、どこに使ったらいいの？
生存者が死亡しました。
ほら、 もっと華麗に踊りましょうか。
新しい禁止区域が指定されました。
伝説的な美しさですね。
受けてみろ。
ここですよ。距離を置きましょう。
生存者が死亡しました。
教会ですか。
生存者が死亡しました。生存者が死亡しました。
ああ、眩しいです。ごめんなさい。小さな雲が。
受けてみろ。
教会です。一時は華麗だったところのようですね。こんなに美しくないことをしなければならないなんて。美学の始まりはごめんなさい、小さな友よ。美しさのためには休息。
新しい禁止区域が指定されました。生存者が死亡しました。生存者が死亡しました。
ステップバック。一時は華麗だったところのようですね。ああ、眩しいです。期待してはいけませんよね。ええ、知っています。私に集中してくれませんか。なんて
生存者が死亡しました。
友よ、
敵を防ぐことができません。
一時は華麗だったところのようです。期待してはいけませんよね。
That fish don't follow me.
知っていますよ。
This.
これは本当に美しい装置ですね。どんな美しさを見せてくれる。
生存者が死亡しました。敵が連続キルを達成しています。
踊りましょう。私の踊りはここでも止まらないのです。
新しい禁止区域が指定されました。 します。
それなりの美学はあります。
覚悟しろよ。
白い建物は美しいですね。ごめんなさい、小さな友よ。もっと華麗に。伝説的な美しさですね。私にしてくれませんか。
実感してろ。生存者が死亡しました。死亡しました。生存者が5人残りました。
これは見苦しいことでしょうか。私に集中してくれませんか。
新しい禁止区域が指定されました。生存者が死亡しました。
終わりましょうか。
敵が環境を支配します。
眩しいです。ごめんなさい、小さなグラウンドで一緒に踊りましょうか。セカンドステップですね。ダンスシューズはありませんか。小さな友。
生存者が死亡しました。最終生存者3人です。
あそこの椅子に座ってみませんか。美しくないことをしなければならないなんて。いいことですね。踊りましょうか。サントリオス。
新しい禁止区域が指定されました。
見せてくれるのでしょう。注目してください。私は神が作った最も美しい創造物です。足取りに気をつけましょう。
俺は知らないから。
美しくないことをしなければならないなんて。
しました。圧倒しています。最終生存者2人です。
私がこんな輝きを作り出すなんて。どんな美しさを見せてくれるのでしょう。美しさが咲きました。ごめんなさい、小さな友よ。グラウンドで一緒に踊りましょうか。私に
まもなくセーフゾーンが
小さな友よ。踊っていると喉が渇くものですね。注目し
流れることができないでしょう。
グラウンドで一緒に踊りましょうか。
臨時セーフゾーンが終了されました。もうすぐセキュリティコンソール周辺が最後のセーフゾーンに設定されます。
さあ、舞台から降りる。
その足取りが捕まりました。流れることはでもうすぐ最後のセーフゾーンが解除されます。生存者が死亡しました。圧倒しています。勝利しました。
本当に美しい日です。
これ式の暑さは全部吹き飛ばしてやる。よし、準備は終わったから覚悟しろよ。
that was a core asset in maintaining his image as insignificant. He didn't dress as this formal aristocrat who came from riches, but instead chose a more common garb to get people to lower their guard around him. Then, by doing just a little bit of brown-nosing, that was all that was needed to gain control over a brainless idiot like Philip. A few sentences and a bit of positive reinforcement from Ig was all it took for Vianney to lead Philip right where he wanted him. That said, Philip alone was only part of the problem. With the Sorcerer Kingdom stockpile still sitting in the capital, that was the core thing preventing his faction from becoming better. You see, because many of his fellow nobles were only noble in name, most had no interest in managing their domains at all. They were all like Philip and completely useless, drunk on the power that fell into their laps, all while believing they were each destined for absolute greatness. So, when confronted with the obvious issue of a foreign power controlling the price of their crops, even with Vianney indirectly pointing out how this was bad, most nobles he talked to believed they'd come out on top. They believed that by growing cash crops and selling them at a premium, the excess money they would make would just be used to buy provisions from the Sorcerer Kingdom. It was, after all, a readily available stockpile they could just buy from whenever they wanted. The point no one seemed to understand, though, was that this was exactly what the Sorcerer Kingdom wanted. They would wait for the kingdom's harvest to inevitably fail, then jack up the prices of their own product when they become the only supplier of it. An obvious play intended to make the kingdom dependent on the Sorcerer Kingdom. That being the case, the only way Vianney could come up with to prevent this from happening was by doing something about the Sorcerer Kingdom's stockpile. If he could somehow get rid of that foothold on the market, perhaps the nobles who saw it as this opportunity to grow cash crops would instead reconsider and start managing their domains properly. With no backup supply that they could just purchase from, even these moronic nobles would see that they have to grow real crops. That or end up starving for the winter. The core problem with a plan like this, though, was that you needed a special kind of stupid to attack the Sorcerer Kingdom. A person so dumb and so gullible that Vianney didn't even think it was possible to find someone like that. So, when Philip agreed to do exactly that, Vianney couldn't help but think that Philip was trying to play him instead. It was truly hard to believe that Philip was that dumb. Perhaps what was going on instead was that Philip would follow through with the attack on the convoy, then pin the blame on him since the attack was going to happen in his domain. I mean, that seemed much more likely than just straight up stealing from the Sorcerer Kingdom. If that was going to happen though, Vianney would simply ambush the ambush, then gain favor with the Sorcerer Kingdom after having defended their convoy. It was a plan that should work so long as there were no survivors. Either way, as long as the convoy was attacked by Philip, there was definitely some sort of benefit to be gained from it. At the very least, Philip was sure to be removed from their faction, but perhaps the Sorcerer Kingdom may even withdraw their stockpile. If the kingdom proved themselves unable to defend their goods, then perhaps the Sorcerer Kingdom would lose trust in the merchants that they were hiring. That was the outcome that would by far be the best case for everyone. Now, if you're wondering why Vianney was going so far to incite change, well, that's simply because he wanted to make things better. He didn't have the money or power to do it himself, but what he did have was a single genuine desire to improve the quality of life in his own domain. A task that wasn't possible unless the kingdom itself started to change. So, with a single passion to make him and his people's lives better, Vianney was willing to put in the hard work needed to get it done. Work that he knew needed to start from within his own faction. If he wanted to move up and create the better life he so desired, then the necessary tools for that were achievements and connections, both of which could only be gained by starting with this faction of rejects. Now, despite this being extremely risky, even Vianney didn't believe this attack would result in a war. I mean, for one, he never thought Philip would succeed in the first place, and a convoy like this was way too trivial to get so worked up over. Combine this with their small territory and limited numbers, and Vianney believed the worst case scenario was the loss of a few more border provinces, something that didn't affect him since his domain was at the other end of the country. Fast forward to the actual day of the attack, and out of all the villagers Philip attempted to recruit from his entire domain, only 50 showed up to take part in this. It was a feeble showing considering his call had gone out to everyone. Then, to make things worse, the people who did show up didn't even look like they were capable of fighting. Most were well past the age befitting that of a capable worker, and their unkempt demeanor dictated they were the village's outcasts. So, with only dead weight given to carry out his plan, Philip couldn't help but feel that his people weren't appreciating his genius. They didn't seem to understand the tremendous benefits such a mission would bring them. But, even so, Philip was still certain that this was where his legend would begin. As the first and only person to strike a blow against the Sorcerer Kingdom, Philip was sure the kingdom would shower him in glory for it, perhaps even reward him by giving him the hand of the princess. Many of the people alongside him didn't think the same, but when they had asked if this plan would actually work, Philip reaffirmed his thoughts and stated how their actions would save their country. Of course, no one truly believed him, but their lack of faith only showed just how short-sighted they were. Only a brilliant mind like Philip's could truly grasp the extent to which this plan would benefit them. Now, it was after Philip and his men were settled that Vianney and Ig would show up with their own forces. 75 each, hidden deep in the forest on either side of Philip, thus bringing the overall number of troops to 200. When Philip heard that that's how the troops were deployed, he immediately recognized the layout as the legendary Crane Wing formation, an inverted wedge-like shape that numerous war heroes had used before him. Of course, with Philip knowing nothing about the actual purpose of it, there was a bit of confusion when Vianney explained how retreat was all part of it. You see, when Vianney had asked which way Philip would run when the battle got started, Philip mistook this question as Vianney saying that he would lose. What Philip wasn't understanding, though, was that this retreat was simply a facade in order to get the enemy forces to chase them. It was the whole point of setting up in this formation in the first place. They would make it seem like they were losing the fight, run away to lead the enemies out of position, then quickly turn and have the forces on each wing come and flank them. That was the plan with which Philip and the others would proceed with. They would wait in the forest until the convoy could be seen, then jump out in an ambush and begin their attack. One last thing to note about the setup is that, despite Vianney and Ig using masks to hide their face, Philip's full-plate armor was too hot for him to keep his helmet on. So, rather than continue to keep his identity hidden, he instead decided to proceed with the helmet off, leaving his face in the open for all to see. Now, while Philip and the others awaited the convoy, a large portion of the story was spent showing the perspective of the merchant in charge of it, a man currently in debt to the Eight Fingers who also just so happened to be a member of their smuggling division. So, when the time came for him to start paying that loan back, part of that payment involved transporting goods for the Sorcerer Kingdom. It was a job he never imagined he'd be a part of, yet here he was leading the convoy alongside a group of mercenaries. With 24 guards, all part of the Eight Fingers payroll, the safety of these goods were all but guaranteed. Reason being that mercenaries like these who were part of the Eight Fingers were highly loyal and extremely trustworthy, much to the point that if things started to get dicey, Christopher knew each of them would defend the convoy with their life. If they didn't, then the Eight Fingers were sure to hunt them down and kill them anyway. That said, despite these guards being handpicked by the same clients he worked for, Christopher still wished for someone stronger, preferably someone from the Six Arms. But ever since their supposed defeat in a 1v6 to Brain Unglaus, the best he could hope for was what he had now. A group of mercs who seemed far more relaxed than they should be. That's not to say they weren't good at what they did, but considering they were traveling with the Flags of Ainz, the probability of someone attacking them was extremely low. Plus, anyone foolish enough to even try that was either starving bandits too ignorant to know who they were up against, or a rival syndicate trying to create trouble for the Fingers. Either way, the lead mercenary was confident his group could take on both those threats. Like, even if they were outnumbered 200 to 24, if all they were up against was a bunch of bandits without any combat experience, then him and his group could easily take on all of them. Funnily enough, it was shortly after this comment was made that the advanced guard brought news of a potential ambush up ahead. The reason they saw it only as a potential ambush was because the people waiting and hiding were nothing but villagers. They weren't bandits or thieves equipped with any sort of weapons, but instead simple townfolk carrying nothing but farming gear. So, the fact the most dangerous thing they carried was a simple hoe, Christopher couldn't be sure that they were actually ambushing him. And because it was very possible they were actual farmers, sending men to chase them off could send off the wrong message. If word got out that the Sorcerer Kingdom convoy messed with farmers, then Christopher would be the one responsible for having caused that. That being the case, he couldn't risk doing anything that would reflect poorly on the nation he was representing. So, after considering potential possibilities as to why 50 people were out here, Christopher decided the best thing to do was to scout the surrounding area first. Since the villagers' positions were so blatantly obvious, if farming wasn't what they were there for, then it was very possible they were there to bait for a bigger trap. A seemingly incompetent group intended to pull the convoy in. When the scouts returned after finding nothing though, Christopher could only conclude that these people were just farmers. An assumption reinforced by the lack of additional troops, but quickly proven wrong when the villagers stepped in to stop them. They didn't immediately attack like how an ambush should have been, but instead just stood in the road to form a roadblock. It was a confusing sight since many of the people blocking them looked scared to be there. They didn't seem like they wanted to fight, but instead stood with a look of pure uncertainty. Plus, if they were planning to attack, then even a complete idiot of a leader would have had them stay in hiding. Because they were all out here standing in the road though, that meant that this was something different. Something Christopher could only find out by confronting the people directly. So, with a merc to defend him and another to attack, Christopher would leave the convoy to talk to these villagers. He would state his purpose from behind the safety of a tower shield, then await a response from whoever was their leader. When that leader turned out to be a noble he recognized, Christopher's mind toiled in an attempt to understand what was happening. First, he tried to comprehend why Philip was in a domain so far from his own, but after hearing how he was here to disrupt the business of the Sorcerer Kingdom, Christopher's only thought was to eliminate the threat in front of him. It was right before he was about to give those orders, though, that Christopher began to feel as if something was off. He remembered that Philip was working for Hilma. So, if this was truly the same Philip who worked for the Eight Fingers, then there had to be a reason why he was doing this. I mean, no sane nobleman would attack a convoy from the Sorcerer Kingdom, let alone one who was stupid enough to show their face like this. So, since Philip's face was right out here in the open, perhaps his true intention was to let Christopher know it was him. Or maybe the true culprit was simply using the illusion spell to make it seem like Philip was behind this. If that was in fact the case though, then that meant the villagers behind him may also not be what they seem. Then, with such an idiotic pretense of attacking just for the sake of stealing food, Christopher was certain it was everything other than that. What I mean is that the idea of stealing from Ainz was so incredibly stupid that Christopher was absolutely confident something else was going on. It could be a rival syndicate, a betrayal from within the Eight Fingers itself, a secret plan intended to force him to Philip, or even...
実験が始まりました。レーダーを活性化します。
嫌だけど泣いても俺は知らないからな。二度は乗りたくない。喧嘩をかけたらただでは置かないぞ。ひどくはしないけど、まあこれくらいなら使えるだろう。小細工なんかしないぞ。二度は乗りたくない。これは何の匂い？何を焦がすんだ？頭が痛くなってきた。予想以上に面倒だな。力加減が難しいんだよ。仕方ないだろ。見たか？俺もやればできるんだぜ。ちょっと大変だったけど。これは何の匂い？何を焦がすんだ？海辺での撮影は日焼け止めをいっぱい塗らないといけない。そうしないと肌が剥がれるんだ。作ったんだからいいだろ。これはなかなか良くないか。クーラーボックスはないかな。
生存者が死亡しました。
効かない気分だよ。投げることにも自信あるぜ。有名になったらこんな家でも住めるんだ。でも必要ない。これはなかなか良くないか。俺は平気だ。クラクラとかしてないぞ。なんだか眠くなってきた。
新しい禁止区域が指定されました。
力加減が難しいんだよ。仕方ないだろ。
存者が死亡しました。生存者が死亡しました。
なんだか眠くなって
生存者が死亡しました。敵が連続キルを達成しています。生存者が死亡しました。
これはなかなか良くないか。肝だめ
生存者が死亡しました。
つもりか。
敵が連続キルを達成しています。
俺は平気だ。クラクラとかしてないぞ。夏の海はすごく青く見えるな。
生存者が死亡しました。
どれどれ。泣いても俺は知らないからな。ごめんな。夏の海はすごく青く見えるな。避けられなかったら投げてみろ。
新しい禁止区域が指定されました。
投げることにも自信あるぜ。もう我慢しない。もう俺は知らないからな。
生存者が死亡しました。生存者が10人残りました。生存者が死亡しました。
been a larger plot designed to provoke war between the two kingdoms. There was a limitless number of possibilities under which this situation could have arisen from. One thing Christopher knew for sure though was that Philip definitely wasn't here just to steal food. So as he continued to contemplate all the reasons why Philip would be doing this, Christopher decided the worst thing to do was to kill him. If he acted rashly and killed Philip right away, then not only would the act be perceived as a Sorcerer Kingdom convoy killing a kingdom noble, but Hilma might directly punish him for killing one of her pawns. At least if he let Philip live and gave him the convoy, he could always report back to Hilma and use Philip as a scapegoat. So with that train of thought influencing his decision, Christopher decided it was best to just leave. As long as Philip didn't chase or attack any of his men, he would abandon the convoy and just walk away. At first, the mercenaries believed Christopher was under some sort of spell, but after seeing just how serious he was when giving the order, they reluctantly accepted and departed as well, thus granting Philip his victory over the Sorcerer Kingdom. Philip would have preferred they left the horses as well, but when a hidden archer shot an arrow right next to his head, Philip felt it best not to push his luck anymore. So while he did have these massive wagons of food prime for the taking, unfortunately he had nothing to move them with. Even so, considering the goods were his and no one was hurt, Philip still believed this to be a flawless victory. He was, after all, the first and only man to successfully steal a flag from the Sorcerer Kingdom, and that would be his prize for this amazing accomplishment. So, as he trampled over the other flags representing his enemy, Philip couldn't help but consider himself this brilliant tactician. I mean, not only did he do what no other person could, but the success of this operation had all but proved it. He had followed through with the act that would prove his greatness and was now in possession of the spoils of victory that confirmed it. It was everything he needed to affirm the glorious future ahead of him. But yeah, that's pretty much the legend of Philip. We may not see him again till the very end of the season, but one of the most important things that you need to know about Ainz is that everything he does is all for the direct benefit of Nazarick. I know sometimes it may not seem that way, but even now while he's annihilating an entire country, all those innocent deaths are something he's planning to profit from. So as we go through the cut content for this setup of an episode, you'll slowly come to realize why Ainz is doing what he's doing here. I promise it's not just killing for the sake of killing. There is a reason for Ainz's warpath. Before we get started though, a quick reminder that you can still buy the Succube apparel and down below, covering chapter 2 from volume 14 of the light novel. With the kingdom right on the cusp of war, Zenek was worried his father wouldn't be able to make the best decision here. You see, ever since his closest friend was lost in battle, the king's physical well-being was clearly starting to deteriorate. He was rapidly aging in a manner that left him as only skin and bones. So, considering this sudden lack of vitality, Zenek feared his father wouldn't be in the right state of mind to handle this. It was a situation he felt may require some drastic measures, especially when the king started protecting Philip on the basis that he could be innocent. Since many were convinced this whole thing was just a ploy set up by the Sorcerer Kingdom, King Ramposa was adamant about not setting up this risky precedent. You see, for every time a plot was carried out by their undead neighbors, the king didn't want to have to start sacrificing innocents just to appease them. It was an unsustainable method.
任務ですか。
Of handling conflict that was just plain barbaric. That being the case, Zenek was sure his father was failing to see the bigger picture here. Then, with his absolute refusal to become a vassal state either, Zenek knew he'd have his work cut out for him. What he did value from his father's conviction, though, was the respect he commanded from the people he disagreed with. Despite not always seeing eye to eye with the council next to him, each and every minister admired his benevolent nature in extremely high regard. As a king who attracted people who were much better than himself, Zenek was hoping he'd be able to take advantage of that in the future. The thing is, with the king now making decisions that could destroy their very nation, the inevitable plot Zenek would have to use to remove him from power would undoubtedly sever all ties with the people he was hoping to rely on. Then, with his sister being sent off to some remote manor to live with Klein, when the time did come for Zenek to take his rule, he would neither have his father's magnetism nor his sister's wisdom, both of which were key assets he was hoping to use to make lasting change. So, while Zenek did consider himself to be a superior king to his brother Barbaro, he wasn't so sure that he could do much better anymore. The tools he needed to do so were all but gone now. Now, the final act that showed Zenek his father was unfit was the lack of reasoning as to why Philip's head shouldn't be used as a bargaining chip. Like, even if he was innocent and it was all just a ploy, the life of one noble certainly wasn't worth more than the life of everyone else. But with his father showing zero leeway when it came to this topic, Zenek knew the only way to get past his objections was to usurp him. He was so close to gaining the throne legitimately, yet the very last step of the way required him to take it by force. If he didn't, then it was very likely there wouldn't be any kingdom left for him to rule over after. So, as Zenek considered which ministers and which soldiers to get on his side, that's when the messenger entered with news of Albedo's arrival, leading us to the following meeting with the Sorcerer Kingdom's envoy. Normally, the king wouldn't ever meet an envoy on the same day of their arrival, but considering the severity of the situation, listening to what she had to say was of the utmost priority. Now, the first thing to note about her arrival was the dark pink gown that she was supposed to be wearing here. It was an outfit so out of place for the gown that she was supposed to be wearing here. It was an outfit so out of place for the discussion about to be had, yet no one in the room could doubt it was worn intentionally. As for what signal this dress was supposed to send, though, well, that was a message that would be found out shortly. When the king offered his life as an apology next, Zenek was by far the most shocked out of everyone. Not because of the wild offer his father had just made, but instead because of the realization that this was his plan all along. As a king whose job was to put the needs of his kingdom first, that also included situations like these. Situations where the only hope for resolution was the highest level of sincerity offered by the king.
実験が始まりました。レーダーを活性化します。
次はちゃんとしたものができるでしょう。手がかりは些細なところに隠されていたりもします。一人で考え事をするには良さそうですが、罠ではないでしょうね。潜入開始します。頑張ってはみたんですが。新しいターゲットですね。常に死を記憶しなければならない。罠ではないでしょうね。次はちゃんとしたものができるでしょう。だからでしょう。騙される側がアホなのです。いつも何かにすがりたがるものですね。さあ、ターゲットはどの辺まで行ってるのか。罠ではないでしょう。どうですか。される側がアホなのです。手がかりは些細なところに隠されていたりします。 ないよりはマシです。まあ自画自賛していました。ターゲット確認しました。これは印象的ですね。床で寝ると全身がズキズキはします。罠ではないでしょう。任務の成功率が高くなったようですね。早くターゲットを探しましょう。開けてみましょう。
新しい禁止区域が指定されました。
何の感情もありません。早くターゲットを探しましょう。ターゲット確認しました。ベッドか。懐かしいですね。これは印象的ですね。任務の成功率が高くなったようですね。早くターゲットを探しましょう。罠ではないでしょうね。任務の成功率が高くなったようですね。さあ、迷う必要はないですね。開けてみましょう。覚悟してください。互いに夢はわかる。
生存者が死亡しました。
ターゲットはどの辺にあるのかな。清潔な雰囲気も嫌いではありません。何の感情もありません。
生存者が死亡しました。
友達、そういうのが必要ですか。覚悟して
生存者が死亡しました。
受けてみるがよい。降り注いでやろう。
さあ、
どいてください。
迷う必要は
私を信じてください。
弓も扱えますが、必要ですか。コンディショ
新しい禁止区域が指定されました。
ンの遂行には不可欠です。
生存者が死亡しました。
覚悟してください。何の感情もありません。
生存者が死亡しました。生存者が10人残りました。
重要的スタンバランスとアンバランス。重要的スタンバランスとアンバランス。
今回の任務に成功します。
私を信じてください。今日だ。
生存者が死亡しました。
動きもしないターゲットで練習するなんて無意味です。
構成が決めてくれます。先生、決めましょうか。あ、月は気まぐれででしょう。条件ですね。
任務
あげてあげます。
覚悟してください。偽装します。
生存者が死亡しました。
みっともないミスをしてしまいましたね。
I'm just doing whatever. Whatever, I think I'll have fun doing.
The reigning monarch themselves. So, for any normal nation receiving it, an apology like this, along with the head of the king, would undoubtedly be more than enough to settle any matter. If they were to demand more than that, then every other nation on the continent would only ridicule them. But because the nation they were dealing with was the Sorcerer Kingdom, one measly life wasn't enough to appease them. The very notion was enough to cause Albedo to cease all formalities with them. The king didn't realize it until partway through, but the moment he did was the moment he started seeing reality for what it really was. This wasn't a political envoy that he was dealing with, but instead a demon talking down to a human. It didn't matter at all that he was a king, because to her a human was just a human. He was absolutely nothing that deserved a level of respect befitting of that. None. So, once Ramposa saw his situation was futile, the thought did cross his mind to kill this envoy, but an act like that would only alienate every other nation. All the blame would 100% fall on them, and no country would want to help one that killed a messenger. What they could do instead, though, was send word to every other nation of the apology they tried to offer. Perhaps by letting them know that the king's head wasn't enough, the other nations would start to see just how uncooperative their enemy was. Now, in a private conversation with the royal family after, Ramposa did tell Renner and Zenek to run away, but both were well aware that there wasn't anywhere to go. So long as either of them were still alive, the kingdom would continue to live through their bloodline, a notion both were sure the Sorcerer Kingdom wouldn't allow to happen. So, as they both agreed to stay at their father's side, Renner's emotionless face made her seem resolute, while Zenek wasn't so sure that he'd be able to stay unwavering like that. Emotions during a time like this were quite unpredictable. Fast forward now to a month into the war, and the meeting we see Ainz in was one that he was trying his best in. You see, despite his average mind, which made politics and economics completely incomprehensive to him, the topic of war was something that he could actually follow. That didn't mean that he had given up on any of the other briefs, but since this was one that he thoroughly understood, for once Ainz knew he could at least try to meet the standard his guardians had set out for him. When it came to any of the other fields though, Ainz was actually trying to make himself better at them. He definitely would have preferred to just hand it off to Albedo, but with every guardian always harping on every little word he says, it was only a matter of time until he'd say something which would lead Nazarick towards some incalculable losses. So, the best way to prevent that from ever happening was to eliminate the problem right at the source. And that meant making himself a better person. If the Guardians were always going to seek Ainz's opinion, then Ainz needed to make sure that his opinion was the right one. Thus the reason he was reading all these self-help and business books. It was the least he could do to mitigate the risk that was himself. Now, while Ainz did mention the efforts of Demiurge and Albedo, there wasn't much said about Cocytus's part. You see, as the person in charge of enacting the actual conquest, he was the one who made sure the cities were annihilated to completion, a task that required 0 survivors. Without that strict policy of sparing no one, it was much less likely that they would have been able to keep their invasion of the Eastern Front a secret for so long. So even with the small number of undead given to act it out, Cocytus had successfully made ruin of each and every city that he visited. He had even gone so far as to wipe one out by himself. Of course, given that the person behind him right now was Pistonia, Ainz didn't really feel all that comfortable talking about it. He could only imagine the glare that she was giving him for causing so much death. That said though, because this killing did have an actual purpose to it, Ainz was hoping that she could at least understand why it was necessary. It's not like he gained some sick, twisted pleasure from doing it, but he had no problems killing if it meant it would make Nazarick better. Remember, so long as it was for the direct benefit of Nazarick, there was no limit to the number of people Ainz would kill for it. As for what all this death meant for them here then, well, that ties into Ainz's discussion about failure. If all the lives lost were going to be worth it, then at least one of his city conquests needed to end with failure. It didn't matter how or when it happened, but so long as one of them didn't succeed, the experience gained from it would be invaluable. So, out of all the things that Ainz had hoped for in this war, the thing he wanted most right now was defeat. For a bit more context as to why, well, because not everyone can be like Touch Me and pursue growth even after winning, sometimes what someone needs to realize their shortcomings is a solid blow which helps to highlight them. From Ainz's past experience with his guild, failure was an essential encounter which would make Nazarick all the better from it. His invasions of enemy strongholds and numerous campaigns of conquest undoubtedly gave him the experience needed to handle situations like this. So, in hopes of spreading that experience across Nazarick, Ainz wanted his guardians to experiment with conquests of their own. Not only was that sure to be useful later on, but it was all to better prepare them for their inevitable face-off against another guild. Of course, nothing had gone to indicate that another one existed, but if there was one thing that Ainz was absolutely certain about, it was that eventually there would come a time where he and Nazarick would have to face off against another guild. It may not happen anytime soon, but to assume Ainz ul Gon was the only guild in the New World was the epitome of foolishness that would certainly lead to their demise. So, in order to get his people ready for that eventuality, experience was the cornerstone that would guide them through it. It was especially helpful since none of the Guardians could get any stronger than their level 100 builds allowed them to. That being the case, Ainz thought it best to work on the only thing that they could improve upon. Then, by having these conquests recorded and distributed throughout Nazarick, the history Demiurge and the others were about to make would serve as the basis for the weaker denizens to learn from. They may be too weak to risk having on the front lines right now, but perhaps in time minions like the Domain Guardians would be able to take part too. I mean, it was only a matter of time until Ainz would be forced to rely on them. So, to ensure every Floor Guardian had the same opportunity to learn as Calcutus, they were each assigned several conquests in which the goal was to plan them differently. No two cities could be approached with the same invasion plan that someone else had made, and neither Albedo nor Demiurge were allowed to take part in this either. That being the case, there was quite the interesting stratagems that some of the Guardians had come up with. More specifically, the one Shaltir recommended was actually quite hilarious. As the person in charge of freight transport with the dragons, it was only natural for her conquest to involve them as well. Her idea was to have the Frost Dragons carry Soul Eaters, then have them be dropped from 500 yards up into the air. Then, by having the Soul Eaters immediately activate their auras upon landing, any damage taken from the fall itself would quickly be healed through the souls that they were harvesting. So, when you really think about how this plan operated, the whole thing was basically an aerial bombardment of life-stealing predator missiles. Of course, when this plan was implemented for real, a whole slew of issues made the outcome extremely laughable. Not because the idea itself was stupid, but simply because what had happened was actually quite comedic. You see, with many of the Soul Eaters falling on rooftops, the resulting impact they made had led them to bounce in each and every direction. They would either land straight through the roof and make a dramatic entrance, or end up bouncing into a spot that they couldn't recover from. So, with an incident rate like that, a few more experiments were needed before this plan could be.
任務ですか。
could be deemed a success. It did, however, pave the path towards a potential airborne division. As for some of the other plans, there was an interesting one that had 300 Elder Liches carpet bomb with Fireball, then a more covert one that involved the assassination of city leaders. Regardless of what the Floor Guardians did come up with though, the varied approaches to conquests were sure to be educational for everyone. When we get to the meeting with Nigredo next, despite the whole encounter being something Ainz didn't really want to do, putting it off would only lead to bigger problems in the future. To him, this was similar to a separate department wanting to have a face-to-face meeting with him. It didn't happen very often, but when it did, it was sure to invite only trouble. Considering this wasn't something that he could put off though, Ainz dismissed his maid and the 8-edged assassins, then proceeded to the Frost prison where he could begin this meeting privately. The maid did try to insist on coming along, but Ainz couldn't risk having this meeting cause trouble in the future. Even with the maid promising not to see or hear anything, the slightest chance of word getting out was something he wanted to avoid. Now, the first thing to note about Nigredo is that her apparent affection for any type of baby was nothing more than a superficial facade dictated by her flavor text. Yes, she did have an immense soft spot for infants, but the moment those infants turned the age of 2, her love for them became practically non-existent. I believe the exact word they used was died. Ainz didn't explain exactly what that meant, but this severe change in attitude was enough to have any children over the age of 2 taken away from her. Like, all the ones who were saved during Yaldabaoth's invasion in Season 2 were transferred to Pistonia the moment they hit that age threshold. As Ainz himself had put it, to keep them with Nigredo would just result in her having more meat to process. Now, with regards to Pistonia's plea for mercy, there were quite a few factors that made making a decision extremely difficult. You see, while Pistonia did provide valid reason to let more refugees go, the main problem lay with how the other Guardians would perceive it. It wasn't so much an issue for Ainz himself, but by proceeding with a plan that Albedo and Demiurge had already discarded, their reaction to it would definitely become the main cause for concern here. Despite Ainz having already warned them that he would intentionally make mistakes, should this plan cause the overall one to fail completely, then there was no way he himself could fix it alone. Ainz only wanted to take risks that he could manage himself. So, if
実験が始まりました。レーダーを活性化します。
ーゲットも見つけやすそうですね。手がかりは些細なところに隠されていたりもします。任務の成功率が高くなったようですね。頑張ってはみたんですが、偽装します。住人たちを皆追い出したようですね。これは印象的ですね。ないのには任務の成功率が高くなったようですね。自画自賛していました。次はちゃんとしたものができるでしょう。コンディションを維持することもまた任務遂行には不可欠です。開けてみましょう。何の感情もありません。潜入開始します。誰かに出会った時、道を譲るのも難しそうですね。たとえ森の中でも最後には気をつけなければなりません。ないよりはマシです。どうですか？罠ではないでしょう。
新しい禁止区域が指定されました。
さあ、迷う必要はないですね。どうですか？自画自賛していました。人間っていつも何かにすがりたがるものですね。開けてみましょう。早くターゲットを探しましょう。なかなかでしょう。
生存者が死亡しました。
新しいターゲット。
生存者が死亡しました。
互いに運が悪かったということにしておこう。
生存者が死亡しました。
僕の過去が気になりますか？ターゲットはどの辺にあるのかな。早くターゲットを探しましょう。
生存者が死亡しました。
ターゲット確認しました。無駄に時間をかけすぎた。手がかりは些細なところに隠されていたりもします。ターゲット確認しました。何の感情もあり。
生存者が死亡しました。生存者が10人残りました。生存者が死亡しました。新しい禁止区域が指定されました。敵が連続キルを達成しています。
覚悟してください。無駄に時間をかけすぎたから。ここを出るのは任務完了後になるでしょう。
生存者が死亡しました。 生存者が死亡しました。
心の記憶
敵が
は必要
連続キルを達成しています。
以外ですけどね。
生存者が死亡しました。
迷う必
敵
要は
が戦場を支配しています。
新しいターゲット。何の感情もありません。翻訳と工場の作業は似たところがあります。死人に口なしと言うでしょう。役立ちそうなものを持っていることを願います。
これが私よ。
覚悟してください。死人に口なしと言うでしょう。人間っていつも何かにすがりたがるものですね。
ひるんじゃダメよ。
輸送します。今回は任務成功しました。覚悟してください。覚悟した方がいいでしょ
見せてあげる。新しい禁止区域が指定されます。生存者が死亡しました。生存者が5人残りました。
う。してしまいました。